Okay, hello and welcome to the Sprint 31 review. This was an amazing sprint. We'll go into the details in a moment. Next slide. So as usual, I'll give the sprint statistics. Madhu will talk about Automate Tenant Quotas. Greg McCullough will talk about the Automate State Machine and the Event Switchboard. Greg Blomquist will talk about the providers. Greg Tanzillo about the Appliance Core. Alberto about the REST API. Harpreet will discuss the user interface, and Jason will talk about performance. Next slide, please. All right, so this was an amazing sprint. In sprints past, we've merged anywhere between, I don't know, mid 100s to mid 200s. I think 270 or so being the highest we ever did. And in this sprint, we kind of blew that number out of the water. I'd like to thank kind of some people for helping us make that happen. There was Protobahn and Logicalis who worked on Chargeback and finally got their first 2 pull requests in. There was Victor, also goes by the name of, by his GitHub ID, DNNX, who heard Aaron Patterson give a speech about something and got interested in ManageIQ and hacked and actually got 28 pull requests merged, or 7% of that total. The container team did, the container management team did over 30 pull requests, as did the Booz Allen Hamilton team working on the self-service UI. So kind of a lot of different people pitching in and really providing for an amazing sprint. A good spread there between, enhancements and bugs, taking up 3/4 of the pie chart there, and the rest kind of sprinkled around liberally between performance, refactoring, technical debt, and test. Next slide, please. So if we go by feature category, we can see that, as usual, the UI kind of takes almost half of, or whatever, almost half of the pull requests. It does so because, the UI is a big chunk of our code. And everything else was also pretty neatly sprinkled. Providers was 73 pull requests, which is further broken down on the bottom right there, containers being the 31 that I mentioned before. And Azure and OpenStack being the other kind of major pieces of that chart there. So really, we've contributed on all different areas here. Really nice mix, really good to see. Next slide, please. All right, as is customary, Gymnasium, our Ruby GemDependencies, we have 160 green, 50 yellows. They don't give us a breakdown of production versus development, so they just say that 50 are yellow in total. It would be really good if they did. Our code coverage remains around 50%. It would be good to kind of start moving that needle up, that metric up. I'd really like to see it around 80%, to be honest. Next slide, please. Some work on other repos that we manage. Also a healthy mix there of the Azure Armrest, Linux admin, the appliance, and kind of other areas there. In total, around 50 pull requests on these other repos, as well as contributions that we've made to repositories that we don't own and don't manage. I'm sure that's probably another dozen or so at the very least. So kind of, the team is really working on all fronts, not just the ManageIQ repo, but all these other repos as well as external repos. Next slide, please. All right, I'll turn it over to Madhu.
Okay, I'm actually filling in for Tina, who actually did most of the work here on the Automate Tenant Quota stuff. So previously, we used to have state machines, but they were littered in 3 different places, one for service, one for infrastructure, one for cloud. Now we have consolidated all of them into one, and all the methods are actually being shared. So in the state machine, you actually have a clear distinction of, where the source is, where you're getting the data from. Because with the 3 different sources, we actually added another one, which is the tenant-based model. And going forward, we're going to be using the default tenant quota model for actually doing all the quota validation. In the UI, there have been changes to actually make it a lot easier to actually fill in those values up front for tenant, and also being, like aggregated up from the subtenants and stuff like that. To stay backward compatible, we're still going to be supporting the old tags-based approach that we used to do with groups. You'd basically, like if you're trying to do a max CPU quota validation, you would actually create a tag called quota max CPU, and if you're doing for storage, you'd actually call it quota max storage. The old state machine is still there, so if there are customers who want to use the old one, they can still go back to the old model. Next slide, please. So like I said, in the UI, we have a way where you can easily enforce the different policies. I think we have 6 different selections you can choose from, and in this example we are enforcing the allocated virtual CPU count, which is enforced as 30. You can actually set any value you want. For the memory, I think it's based on gigabytes. This framework is actually extensible to add new constraints if we need them. Next slide, please. So during automate, when we start the automate engine, we actually have an approval phase, and during the approval phase, you can actually validate these quota constraints and make sure that you're within the bounds. And if for some reason you're out of the bounds, you actually get a message saying your quota has exceeded, and you get an appropriate message saying what your limits are and what needs to be changed. That's it. Next slide, please.
All right. So I'm filling in for Madhu because he's filling in for Tina. So Madhu added this feature. We got a use case where someone was doing a VM provisioning, and not until after the VM was created and they could evaluate that they realized that there were issues. I think it was largely around networking, but so the desire was to be able to replay states in the state machine, which in Automate we don't support with the next state option that we had introduced a little while back. So we realized that we could do this. Just jumping back in the state when we're in the same kind of workspace doesn't work, because you can replay relationships and attributes, and things kind of get messed up with that. So through the retry logic, that pretty much restarts the whole instantiation of Automate, and you end up with a clean workspace at that point. So we enabled this restart flag, which by default will take you back to the very beginning of the state machine. So you can hit an error and decide that you want to roll back to the beginning, or specify a specific state. Here, they wanted to go back to the auto placement state and repick values based on where they were, things they had picked last time. They can store and evaluate those state values. And so now, with this option, you have the ability to kind of jump back in the state machine by using the restart flag. And the 2 things to really note here are that we're not tracking that restart, so you can put yourself into an infinite loop here if you're not tracking it. So we recommend using the state bars to keep track of your retries, your states on your own. States all have their individual retries, but those get reset as you transition to each state. So those won't come into, they'll be reset if you jump back into the state machine. And in this case, cleaning up basically what you've done to that point. So here a VM was created, so needed to make sure that they destroyed that VM, cleaned up any other environments or changes that they had made before they jump back. So that's all the responsibility of the author of the state machine to deal with those types of scenarios. So, all right, next slide. Okay, around tenancy, a lot of kind of under the cover changes, but we started assigning default groups into the tenants, as well as VMs and services, which were previously had the ability to be owned by a group. It wasn't enforced, and now we're kind of made that a requirement. So they've all been updated, and they were assigned to a tenant, so the default group falls into that. A group has a single tenant relationship, so we were able to update all the VMs and services that have that, and as new ones are created or provisioned, they get assigned as well. The middle bullet point there, the past user identity, this is kind of a big one. There were a lot of PRs in this sprint around cleaning this up. So the users can belong to multiple groups. Groups belong to tenants. We track some of that, persist some of it in the database, but those things can change. So we wanted to keep those objects in memory and retain the full user identity as we're going through things like provisioning. When events come in, as well as automate, we need to identify really those three elements of a user to understand really what space they're working in. The tenant defines the automate domains that are in play. Ultimately, the group will define what resources or entitlements they have to resources in the system. So a lot of cleanup around that one. And then automate, the import-export has been updated. So if you're importing, you can only import into the domains that are within your current tenant. And export was only the domains that you have visibility to. So if there's domains defined in other tenants, we make sure that those don't get exported to people that don't have visibility to it. And there's always some service model updates to expose a few more relationships based on the tenant model. So next slide. All right, so the event switchboard's been kind of talked about and around for a while, so this PR finally got merged, and I want to thank Lucy for a lot of hard work on getting this one to this point. Really, what the switchboard is before we would process events within the models, and you could get to them in Automate, but it wasn't the initial point of interaction. So now what we've done is the events start processing in Automate. I'll show this a little bit more in the next couple of slides, but it allows someone to override, down here, it basically enables us to add Automate handlers and customize the event processing. So any event coming into the system can now be overridden, changed, enhanced. It really gives a lot of flexibility to all of the event processing. We've centralized all this stuff into the Automate model, where before it was kind of right out of this event handler that was sitting on each appliance. And through the modeling that we've done, we've been able to organize these a lot better, and I'll show that in slides as well. And the last part is that obviously through Automate, these changes are live, so you don't have to do any appliance changes to be able to have them take effect. They're pretty much immediately take effect. Let's see. And in notes, obviously, no events need to be added to the model. If you change the old event handler file, they'll be ignored. One of the concerns we have the concept of built-in methods in Automate, which we don't use too much. But if you run a method, like a Ruby script that spins up a Ruby process, and that there's overhead to that, by using these built-in methods, we can process inline so that we don't have that extra overhead. So we've added a bunch of event handler built-in methods to deal with the common tasks that we do, so that out of the box we keep the performance as close to what we had before as possible, while still driving through the Automate engine. And then, of course, since all this stuff moved into the Automate domain, you need to make sure that the ManageIQ domain is updated so that you pull in all the new event instances and methods that are required for this. So next slide. I'm going to go through a little bit what some of the changes look like. So the top one, the old entry point, the events come in through system process, and then the event instance. You just see we used to just take the event type, which is largely the name, and pass that over to the system event namespace. So now on the bottom, we have an event stream, which is the base model for all of the events coming through the system. We created an event namespace, which by default is really just the model name for the subclass events. I'll show that. And then the source, which for something like a provider would be the source type, Rev, OpenStack, VMware. So that's really where the namespacing support was added, and then of course the event type on the end is passed along as well. So, next slide. So here's kind of what that namespacing or that instance relationship ends up looking like. Under system event, it used to be a flat list of event entries coming in, and on the right, under system event is kind of this namespacing. So the EMS event is the namespace for the event, and then you can see the different providers listed underneath there. And as we add new providers, new namespaces will come into play there. Much easier to identify, even compared to the old event handling file. It was just a flat list of events, and maybe by the structure of the event name, you can figure out what provider it was from, but it wasn't always clear. And then MIQ event and request events are all just different subclasses of that event stream model that handle different events coming into the system. Next slide. And then looking at just one of the events here, you see basically we leave room kind of before and after our processing. So if someone needs to get in and do any kind of changes to these events, they have entry points for relationships and methods to specify their own processing, as well as, if you look at the relationship for there, that's one of the new built-in event handlers that in that one is doing a refresh and using the target, which is the EMS of the object that's the event is for. I think next slide. All right. So I'm saying new events here, but actually there were events in the system that we weren't exposing through the control interface. So the top checklist there is all of the events that are now provided, with the bottom list just showing the events that were available in the system that we hadn't added to the UI. So just went through a little cleanup and provided a bunch of host events that can now be accessed through control. Next slide. All right, over to Greg B.
All right. Thanks, Greg. So as Oleg pointed out, this was really a record sprint for everyone. The providers group saw 73 PRs merged, which is just astounding. That's more than double what we had last sprint for the providers group. There's a few notable changes I want to call out. First, from the OpenStack integration team, Vladislav did a bunch of work around cleaning up tests, which is really one of those kind of underappreciated and often neglected areas of any project. But it's hugely important. It improves maintainability and adds to the overall success. And then in Ladislav's spare time, he also managed to add OpenStack Neutron inventory collection. And if you remember from last sprint, Ladislav worked really hard on getting the database changes to better support Neutron. And now ManageIQ is collecting the data that gets dumped into those tables. I'm really looking forward to seeing this all in action when we get all this integrated into the UI. Next slide. So we saw nothing short of a monumental effort from the container integration team. They got a jaw-dropping 31 PRs merged. And to put that in perspective, that's almost the total number of PRs for all providers that were merged last sprint. They mainly focused on polishing the great work they've already done. For instance, we saw updates to node relationships, updates to show operating system information for container images, and updates to the topology widget. And there's a few things I want to call out specifically, a few changes. So if you go to the next slide. So now ManageIQ can show resource quota information for a project in Kubernetes, and providing this visibility really fits nicely into just the central goals of ManageIQ, surfacing that management data. If you go to the next slide. So this is another change that kind of does a great job of surfacing that core management information, where we can see the status of Kubernetes components. And then if you jump to the next slide. So the last thing I wanted to bring up from the containers team was the addition of the atomic provider. One thing that's hugely important in ManageIQ is covering the provider playing field. So seeing changes that add new providers is always a huge win. I just want to say, thanks to the container integration team for all their hard work this sprint. It was just amazing. Next slide. All right, on to Azure. The two big areas we're seeing progress here are inventory collection and orchestration. The Azure team has been working really hard on collecting all the necessary inventory in order to start launching instances from private images, which on the surface sounds kind of straightforward, but there's a lot of nuances to even getting to the point where ManageIQ can even show private images. So the team's been working hard on collecting network details and resource groups. Also, Bill, our local orchestration hero, has been heads down on deploying workloads from Azure templates. So Azure templates they're similar to like Amazon Cloud Formation templates, but to kind of talk more about that, I'm going to hand it over to Bill, and he's going to show off what he's been working on. Bill?
Okay, let me share my screen. Just click here, right? Oh, quick time. Okay, nice. Okay, I just did a lookup at the dictionary. It sounds like this word should pronounce Azure. Okay, so I'm going to use this word. Yeah, Greg already kind of explained. A template is the place you can specify what resources you want to create. And once this resource, the template is defined, you can instantiate it. And the result in the world of Azure is called deployment. And it translated into our ManageIQ term is called stack. And so in this demo, I'm going to demonstrate how to create this so-called stack through our service. So first we will go to the service and find the Azure template, and I'm going to create a new one, give it a name. And this is a very simple template just to create an availability set. And I just copy and paste the content of the template and save it. The template is created. And then from this template, we can create a service dialog. Once it's created, then we're ready to create a catalog item. So I choose a new type, the type called orchestration. I call the name demo. Then select an existing catalog. The dialog is the one we just created. Use the new template we just created. And choose a Azure provider. And leave all the rest as a default. Once that catalog item is created, we are ready to order the service. So we can give the stack a new name called demo1 and fill in the resource group. And there are two parameters. One is the location. The other one is the availability set name. And that request is generated. Have to reload a few times until the service succeeded. Now succeeded, we can go to the stack. Now the new stack called demo1 is generated. There are two parameters and one resource. And we examine the resource, we see that a new availability set is created. We can go back to the services to see the new service we just created. If we want to do any modification, we can use that reconfig option. And we can choose other parameters. For example, I give a new name for that availability set. Then we order the reconfig service. And we go to the request page. And here we need to do a menu approve. Give it a reason. And then I approve it. Then again, we do a couple of refresh until the reconfig task finished. Once it's finished, we can go back to the stack to examine our result. Go back to the demo1 stack and open the resource. We see the new availability set name is show up here. Yeah, this concludes my demo. Okay, I stop my sharing.
Very nice. Bill, thank you very much. Very nice.
Yeah, that was awesome, Bill. So yeah, just an amazing sprint for the whole team, an amazing sprint for providers. And I guess it's over to Greg T to talk about updates to the Appliance Core team.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. Yeah, so it was also a pretty good sprint for our team too, and we got a bunch of PRs in and PRs in a bunch of different areas that we cover. So the first area, as I mentioned last sprint demo, Nick's been hard at work trying to move a bunch of functionality out of the MIQ.NET shell script into the Linux admin gem. And so the last big chunk of functionality that he moved is a network configuration code. So in doing that, he's got pretty nice implementation where there's one application interface now for all the distros that we support. He's got a layer on top of there that detects what distro you're on and instantiates the appropriate subclass so that it's kind of it's hidden from the caller. Right now, it supports CentOS, Fedora, and RHEL, but the way it's with that design, it's real easy to extend to other distros going forward. So being that that's the last bit of functionality to be pulled out of MIQ.NET SH, we were able to basically just get rid of that. And that's pretty significant because that was basically a shell script, and in order to use any of the functionality in it, you had to shell out to it with the right command and the right arguments. It got pretty unwieldy to maintain because it had a lot of functionality that was organically added over the years, and as well as other distros being supported. So this is a much cleaner implementation. It's in the Linux admin gem, and I think it's going to make it much more maintainable going forward. Nice job. Next slide, please. Okay, so we also had some work in the tenancy area. I think Madhu alluded to this a little bit. The back-end tenancy quota model, we've added last bit of functionality for this release for being able to calculate all the quota amounts. There's basically three things that aside from the quotas that are being set, is the amount of quota that a tenant may have allocated to child tenants. So it's looking at the child tenants and working out how much of that quota was given away because that no longer is usable or available to the parent tenant. And then calculations for the amount of quota actually being used, the actual resources being used by a tenant. And then that goes into calculation for the amount available to be used or allocated again by a tenant. So basically the configured amount minus the allocated minus the used. And we've added validations using that information to prevent over-allocating quota to child tenants. Okay, next slide, please. I think we skipped one. We skipped a couple. Okay, so, yep. Okay, so on the reporting side, it's like, oh man, you're out of order. On the reporting side, we've also made some enhancements. We added these watermark reports, which I'll talk about in a second. And in order to do that, we needed to make the performance at the provider level reportable. It wasn't reportable prior to this. And also added a couple of metrics, new metrics to performance metrics for host sockets and total VMs. So, and then with that, we added a couple of out-of-the-box reports for watermark. You can see them there. They're under providers, so they're by provider. And basically, it's reporting on the high watermark of host sockets at the provider level and number of VMs at the provider level. So it's like the over the time period. Out of the box, it's a monthly report. So it's over the time period of a month. It's the high watermark of those two things. So if you go to the next slide, there's a couple examples of what those reports look like. I'll admit the data is not too exciting in my small environment, but you can kind of get the gist of what's on the report. So basically, you have the month period. The asset name in this case would be the provider. I have one provider. I threw the region in there also. And then you can see the count of VMs, the high watermark in that month period, and it does at least fluctuate slightly on this one. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the watermark report for the host sockets. That one's even less exciting because it's got the same host sockets. Of course, if we move hosts around between providers, then you would see some different numbers there. Okay, next slide, please. So there's also been some enhancements made in the chargeback area, which really hasn't had much love in the last couple of years or so. So as Oleg alluded to in the beginning, there's a team of developers in Spain, backed by Protobon and Logicalis, and led by Sergio Ocon. They're in the process of revamping chargeback, basically from soup to nuts. So they were able to get a couple PRs into this sprint, and one of them is an enhancement where the units of measure for the chargeback rate configuration is now selectable. So in the original chargeback reporting, you basically were stuck with the units of measure that correspond to the metrics that you're calculating, you're applying those rates to. So in some cases, it would force you to put rates in that were like either really tiny or really big, depending on what the unit of measure was. Like if it was like megabytes, and you're rating something in terabytes, then you'd have to put like a really tiny number in there to get the right calculation to come out. So this is the first of many features in this sprint, and there's going to be a lot more to come. Those guys, pretty impressive to basically come up to speed with all the back end and the reporting subsystem and Chargeback and actually get this stuff done. So pretty excited about it. Next slide, please. So here you'll see an example of the rate configuration page there. So with that block, I added that black box there so you can see where the change is. So basically those were static originally, and you could see like for CPU, I think I have terahertz there, and for disk I/O, gigabits per second, and gigabytes and gigabits per second for the other stuff. So that those drop downs have a bunch of different units that are appropriate to the type of metric that you would apply the rate to. All right, next slide, please. I think there's a couple more examples of that. So yeah, just to show you what's in these pull downs so you can see the different units of measure that you can use for these. So CPU and then memory. And of course, it's appropriate to the type of metric it is. Next slide, please. Okay, I thought that was it. All right, over to you, Alberto.
Okay, so REST API side of things was quite busy. We had a bunch of enhancements essentially supporting the self-service UI and tenancy efforts. So we'll start with the self-service UI. So the first one was as services and related service requests were being queried, there was a need to be able to provide the provisioning dialog for those. So that's done via the virtual attributes shown here. The next one, we had an issue where the actions list was really treated like a physical attribute, and it was causing issues. So when you were querying virtual attributes, in this case like custom actions, you wouldn't see the actions list, and that was, that would cause clients to have to query things twice. But we got that fixed here. Next set, we had the custom actions and buttons implemented before, but there was a need for additional information. Here, essentially, when you query the custom actions, the button sets and the button groups there, we return resource actions and related dialog with that. So that's all obtained in the single query. Next slide, please. Alrighty. Yep. So for tenancy, Tim has been pretty busy with that stuff. So we've added a primary collection API tenants. So it's full CRUD. So we can create tenants. Also, posting at the collection level, you can edit and delete multiple tenants in a single request. The individual resource for the edits and deletes, as well as the delete method. The full CRUD there. We've also added the ability to tag tenants. Standard signature for the API. It's a sub-collection tags with assigned and unassigned action to that. Next was so we had added a while back the set ownership to services, but we were short on parity with the UI, so we really needed to introduce that for VMs and templates. So now we can set the owners and groups for those, as shown here with the resources, VMs and templates ID. Next slide, please. Okay, so more tenancy enhancements. So the first one, with users, being members of multiple groups, MIQ groups, we didn't have a way to specify that in the incoming requests. So we have a new HTTP header XMIQ group. So that allows requesters to come in and say, I want to run as that particular group of mine. So this way we do the proper authorization as far as setting the role and all that for that user, for the life of that request. So That makes it pretty flexible on our side, and we've updated the CLI to make that easy for the CLI users, dash group. Another thing done related to that, we also validate the identity of the user. Typo here, used user. So we make sure that the user coming in is in a valid group and role, otherwise they're not allowed in. Off to the next slide, please. All right, so additional enhancements coming in. We had to support entitlements on queries, and that was needed for tenancy, so we can specify roles like the UI does for gets. Also, all right, so we had tagging before, but you had to add the tags directly on the primary collection. But now you can do a post directly to this category, kind of mimicking the feel of the UI. So you can add and create and delete tags specifically for that category as a sub-collection. So that was done there. Another thing Tim did, so we had the ability to edit users, but a user could not update his own password if he was not entitled to edit the users in general. So this is a way of a special handle for that, because again, if you think of a UI where you can change your own password, you may not be entitled to change anybody else's passwords, or in general the user's object, but you can do that now. So, and we validate that. So either a post or a put, and you can update your own, you're authenticated coming in, obviously, from the API side before you do that. Another thing we've added is, that was an ask somewhere else, so the easy way to query the user that has requested a service. Before that, you had the user ID. You could query that, and people really needed more information about the user. So we basically provide the user object, so you can query the services or related service requests, and you get the user, and then you can query individual attributes, .name, .email. So that's that. Other minor changes, we've bumped up versioning to v2.10 for this release. And the old version 2.0 API docs was updated to ASCII-Binder, to be ASCII-Binder compatible. That's on ManageIQ docs. And that's it. Next slide, please.
So on the UI side, we have had a very busy sprint. We had 183 total PRs merged. Out of that, 73 were enhancements, 70 were bugs, and some of them were introduced by recent refactorings. And rest of the PRs were technical debts or refactoring related PRs. Some of the highlights for this sprint were tenancy tagging, quota usage for tenancy allocation validation was added, and finally we said bye-bye to DHTMLX. So all of the DHTMLX components were replaced with Patternfly Bootstrap. There were some changes, a lot of changes to self-service UI, and there's some ongoing styling going on with Patternfly updates. Next slide, please. So these are the DHTMLX components that were replaced. I have some screenshots on the next few slides, before and after, to show what was changed. DHTMLX grids, accordions, toolbars, and layouts were all replaced with Patternfly. Next slide, please. This is a slide to show the toolbars before and after. We are still making some changes to the toolbars, some more enhancements, and some bug fixes in the toolbars area. Next slide, please.
Hey, Harpreet.
Yeah.
For some reason, we're hearing a lot of tapping from you, and I don't see anybody else that isn't muted. Is there something going on around you?
Not really.
Okay. All righty. We'll just get through it.
Is it better now?
Keep talking, I'll let you know.
Okay, okay. Next slide, please. So this is the example of the grids. You can see before and after. Now we have more coverage on the screen, and the scroll bars look much better. Next slide, please. The HTML accordions were replaced with patternfly, and now you can close the accordions with the arrows on the top. As you can see in the catalog items, there's an arrow next to it. Next slide, please. That's the example of tenancy quota allocation screen. So validation was added on the screen. If a user tries to allocate the quota that's over the limit, we show the validation error messages on the screen. Next slide, please. Quota usage summary was added to tenant summary screen. So at the bottom of the screen, you can see the quota usage for tenant and its children. Next slide. These are some of the highlights of the changes to the self-service UI. Basically, the sort order was added to the list views, and there were more columns added for filtering. And the progress bar was added on the top of the screen to show that that the screen is loading. Also, the flash messages were added to the screen. There was in the previous sprint, the dialog submit was not working, so that was completed during this sprint. I have a small demo that shows all these features in the demo. And also in the previous sprint, we were showing the at the bottom of the dialog. At the bottom of the service summary screen, we were showing the raw JSON object, but now you can see the dialog itself on the summary screen of requests and services, so that user knows what are the values that they submitted to provision a service. And also during this sprint, the custom button support was added to services. There's a screenshot at the end of this slide to show the custom buttons initiated. And I'll share my screen to start the demo. You see it, Marian?
Yeah, we see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
So all the numbers on the dashboard and the left navigation now match. Previously on the left navigation, we were just showing the dummy numbers.
Harpreet, are we supposed to be hearing any kind of narrative as you go through this?
Actually, I put all those in the slide, but if you want, I can go over it again.
No, just it would be easier because it's kind of small. That's all.
Okay. That's the submitting the provisioning request for a service, and this is the service that was just provisioned through the self-service UI. And that's it. And that's all from the UI side.
The system has detected that a minimum number of lines are connected to this conference. Do you want to continue your meeting? Press 1 to confirm. If there is no response, the conference will end.
Okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some performance benefits that we've gained in the last sprint. We had reports from people playing around with the Capablanca Alpha and Beta that the appliance memory was much higher than Botvinnik. And part of that we came to realize is because we upgraded to Ruby 2.2 and Rails 4. Ruby 2.2 introduces a new generational garbage collector, which means when objects go out of scope, Ruby will selectively choose which ones to, younger objects, essentially, things that were created most recently, to remove them and leave the older objects around for a larger garbage collection to happen at a later time. What this allows on Ruby side is for the garbage collector to complete faster and not kind of get in your way. But if it needs to collect a lot of memory for a particular purpose, it still can. So unfortunately, the side effect of that is that memory tends to be higher for the trade-off of performance. A number of fronts were taken to improve this memory. One of the things that you can do in Ruby 2.2 is tweak the settings that the garbage collector uses using Ruby GC XXX environment variables. So we've experimented with a bunch of numbers and came up with new values for that, which brings down the resident memory of many processes by quite a bit. On the VMware side, we noticed a lot of problems, particularly in the EMS refresh and the Vim broker. So within the refresh of VMware, we found some gains where we can release large data sets that we're getting from VMware. We can release them early once we've kind of processed them and figured out what we can do with them. We don't need them in memory anymore, so we can get rid of them. Previously, we kind of kept them around and for no reason, really. So those changes were made in VMware, the VMware inventory refresh. On the broker side, we found some debug logging of the response object that we get from VMware. And if the response object is large enough, particularly at the beginning, I think with a large VMware system, about 3,000 VMs, we get a 30 meg XML payload. We would basically add 200 megs of memory for absolutely no reason just to log it and debug, even though we had debug turned off. So it was kind of a silly confluence of things, and so we got rid of that. We also found some wins with string allocations in the Vim broker, where we were kind of creating duplicate strings in many places that were not necessary. Although reducing the string allocations won't affect memory too much, it will affect performance and speed. So that was a nice little win. On the Rails side, we found that when you define an active record relationship between two models, for example, an EXT management system has many VMs. Most relationships, Rails can figure out the inverse relationship automatically and make sure that when you load them in memory, they kind of reference each other and you don't get duplicate objects. But for certain relationships where we've defined different IDs, particularly with EXT management system, where the ID column is typically EMS ID, it's not the same name, Rails can't figure it out. So we've added in the hinting to do the automatic inverse of, and that should cut down on quite a number of objects, particularly during the refresh where we have a very large data set. Finally, on the Rails side, we found an object leakage that we eventually fixed in Rails upstream. Basically, what would happen is the first time you called a relation object, or particularly the dot first method on a model, it would retain whatever was in memory at that time forever. And in a lot of our testing, when we're doing refresh, the first time we loaded it, that happened to be the refresh, and it was enormous. So that object leakage was fixed, and it was fixed upstream and put into 4.2 stable. We've changed our Capablanca to point to 4.2 stable, and we're hoping that Rails can release a 4.2 RC and hopefully a new version of 4.2, so we could link to that instead of having to ride the GitHub repo. So what does this all mean? So putting all these together from a memory perspective on Botvinnik, we saw that a full refresh would push the process upwards of 600 meg. So that's kind of our baseline from Botvinnik. With the Capablanca Alpha, that number went up to 1.2 GB of memory. So that's like 110% more memory. Crazy big. With all these changes, we were able to bring it back down to about 900 meg. So it's still about 50% more memory, but like I said, Ruby 2.2's gain is more memory for processors for performance gains. So on the timing of refreshes, Botvinnik took about 12 minutes to do a large VMware environment. Where I said large VMware is about 300 VMs, 3,000 VMs. So Botvinnik took about 12 minutes. Capablanca Alpha 1, just with upgrading to Ruby 2.2 and using that enormous memory, came down to 7.5 minutes. It was about 38% faster. With all of our memory changes and some of the CPU, the string allocation performance changes, we got that number down to 4.5 minutes. So it's about 63% faster than Botvinnik. So using more memory, but we trade off for performance. Some more numbers on the broker side. Botvinnik, I don't have the numbers from Botvinnik, but I believe the broker would go up to about 1 GB of memory. In the Capablanca Alpha 1, it went up to about 1.4 GB, so it's about 40% higher. But in Capablanca RC1, we've got that number all the way down to about 850 meg, so it's about 15% lower than Botvinnik. So we got it lower and faster. And that's it on the performance side. We're going to keep trying to make it better and faster. That's it.
All right, so with all of that, just want to really thank everyone for an amazing sprint here. If we overlooked anyone, my apologies. So all of that work and the previous sprints culminated in the Capablanca release candidate being available. It's there on releases.manageiq.org, and you can see we have 3 flavors: OpenStack, Overt, or Rev, and VMware. So please download it, try it, and let us know what you think. If there's no significant bugs in a couple of weeks, that will be the stable release. And also, now that Capablanca release candidate is out, the voting on the name of the D release is out on the talk article. So please go there to place your vote, and the name will be announced during the next sprint review. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to questions, and we'd like to answer them if possible. Let's see. So far, I don't see anything there, and I don't hear anything on the phone, and nothing here on in Blue Jeans. Alrighty. So with that, thank you all for joining, and until next time, November 18th. See you all then.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.